Keeping Up with Jones, the Lonnie Jones podcast adventure. I am your host, Lonnie Jones. My wife Jackie and I moved to the city of Huntsville in 1986 for me to be a youth and family minister. I have been a minister since 1980. I have served in this community as a police chaplain assigned to a SWAT team since 1992, and I've been in private practice as a licensed professional counselor since 1998. I'm also an adventure educator and an avid outdoorsman. I dabble in rock climbing and I goof around with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Our life has been full of many wonderful experiences and some just outright adventures. I used to write about those things in a little church bulletin article. So now instead of asking you to read those things, we're just going to talk about them in our podcast. And as we talk about them, we're going to talk about the facts. The facts lead to concepts, and the concepts lead to application. One caveat about the facts is, for the most part, we're going to tell you the facts just as they happened. But every now and then, we're going to tell you the way other people have told us they remember it happening with a little bit of embellishment. It's all good, clean fun and for educational purposes. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy Keeping Up with Jones. Keeping Up with Jones, the Lonnie Jones podcast adventure, is sponsored by SJ&L General Contractors. They are licensed in both Alabama and Tennessee, and they provide services such as mass grading, storm drainage, sewer and concrete improvement, asphalt paving, erosion control, demolition, and heavy hauling. If you need any of these services, contact them 931-433-4660, 931-433-4660. Also, they are in need of heavy equipment operators, concrete finishers, CDL dump truck drivers, and pipe layers. If you're interested in employment with this family-owned business, you can go to the website www.sjnl.com. That's www.sjnl.com. Abseiling. A-B-S-E-I-L-I-N-G. Abseiling. Nobody panic. This is Keeping Up with Jones, the Lonnie Jones podcast adventure, and you have not been slung into the twilight zone and accidentally listening to a spelling bee on your favorite podcast platform. No, we would not be doing a spelling bee here. That would be Uber Nerd. U-B-E-R-N-E-R-D. Those are the people who watch spelling bees, listen to spelling bees, and attend spelling bees. Or it would also be abusive, A-B-U-S-I-V-E. Those are the people who make their children do spelling bees, and that's not us. No, abseiling is a word from the German abseilen, which means to rope down. Now, you're probably more familiar with the term called repelling, and let's make sure we get that right. Repelling, R-A-P-P-E-L-L-I-N-G, not repel, R-E-P-E-L-L-I-N-G, but rappel from the French rappeler, which means to recall or to pull through. Now, this was a technique devised by some early mountaineers and some early rock climbers. Probably the term rappel is attributed to a guy named Roger Frischon-Roche from 1944. Frischon attributed the technique of abseiling to Jean-Charles Straton, who was a Chamonix guide. Now, Chamonix is the area where Mount Blanc is located. And basically, after a failed solo attempt on one of the climbs in 1876, he devised this method so that you could take a rope and you would double it so that it would go around a horn or through a sling, and both ends would hang down the cliff. And then you would, by means of probably wrapping the rope around your body or under one thigh and over the opposite shoulder, walk down. But when you got to the bottom, you pulled one side of the rope and the rope would come back through to you to recall or to pull through after you had roped down. So the term abseiling is used probably in the UK. It's interchangeable probably in Australia, and almost exclusively in America, it's called repelling. And there's lots of different ways to rappel. You can rappel on a double rope or a single rope, and there's all kind of devices you can use. There's active belay devices. There's passive belay devices. We started just using friction of a tree limb and a metal ring from the hardware. So we would have these pictures of the ROTC guys in those little school magazines. And after careful study of the Swiss seat that they were tying with the old gold line twisted rope, we sort of invented our own version of those seats using some flat webbing that we'd found at an industrial store supply or at an Army surplus store. And we were using just, Hauser laid or twisted grass rope from the hardware. And you couldn't have the rope too thick or it wouldn't fit through your ring or it wouldn't fit with a carabiner. So we were using some suboptimal stuff for sure. But you go out to a tree and you get a rope over a limb. You tie one side or attach one side to your harness, run the other side through a ring that's connected to your harness, and you pull yourself up the tree. And at some point, you could stop and hold your hand below the ring and bounce out from the tree and lower yourself to the ground, controlling your friction. And I don't know how many hours I spent in trees doing that. I know that my freshman, sophomore, maybe even my junior year in school, all of my tennis shoes were split right below the ball of my foot because of the walking up the trees using this climbing method. Well, eventually we ran into some real rope. There was a bike shop in Gadsden, Alabama, and they carried PMI, Pigeon Mountain Industry, actual caving or rappelling rope. Now, real rock climbing rappelling rope comes in two versions. It's a rope called a kern mantle. Kern refers to a core and a sheath. Kern mantle. You've got a braided sheath around a core of many nylon fibers or synthetic fibers. And rappelling rope is static. The core is not twisted. Climbing rope is twisted inside the core, and so it gives it a little bit of stretch. Now, in those days, we weren't really doing any serious climbing. We were mostly doing top rope climbing, and we only used the static rope. I had a white rope. My rope was for whatever reason, I liked just the plain manila white rope. My two friends in high school that I did this with, they bought these rolls of orange rope, bright rescue orange PMI rope. And we played with those ropes. I think theirs was a 200-foot length. I think mine was 150-foot length. And we climbed at Steel right outside Gadsden. And we still use those ropes in trees. And we rappelled on Mount Cheehaw. And sometimes we would just go to some low little cliff or, a dirt bank and just practice your technique. Reps of anything help you get better. And so, if you had a 15, 20, 30-foot bank and you could run down, run up, run down, run up, you could really get some reps in on perfecting your technique. And so we would go to this cut through. It's where they built the highway through near where a guy named Bobby Phillips lived. And I'd go spend the night at Bobby's house, and we'd hike over to this little bank that was beside the road. And we would rappel off this dirt bank. And, it's a safe place to practice Australian rappelling. You could practice body wrap rappels. And it was just to us, it was adventuresome, but, probably not over 30 feet tall. And we would play with those ropes. Well, I'd been to Bobby's house, and we had been playing on those dirt banks and having a good time. And it was time for me to go home. And I was driving. I think I was old enough to drive, or I was either in the car with my mom. Anyway, she picked us up or picked me up, and we're going home. And as we went out through the Chakalaka area, this guy that we went to school with, a guy named Charles, and I'll spare him his last name and spare you his last name, but Charles was walking down the side of the road, and he had over his shoulders a coil, and I mean a monstrous coil of orange extension cord. We called it a drop cord back in those days, but it's the heavy duty outdoor bright orange drop cord, extension cord that you use, to run power tools or whatever. And he had a bundle of it. I mean a bundle of it. And he's walking down the road, and I thought nothing of it. On Monday morning, we walked into school, and Charles came to school, and Charles looked like he'd been in a fight. He looked like he'd been in a fight with a bobcat who was using barbed wire nunchucks. This kid looked like he had been beat to death. He had scratches and scars all over him, and he came to me on a beeline, stood over me and said, "What kind of cord are you and Bobby Phillips using?" And then it dawned on me. Charles had seen us rappelling on the dirt bank with Bobby's bright orange PMI rope, and he thought it was extension cord. And he'd taken this bundle of extension cord and hung it over some vertical surface and had decided he was going to slide down it. Now, I don't know if he was using a friction device. I don't know if he was going to use it as a body wrap. All I know that it had failed him, and he had plummeted down. It's a wonder the kid wasn't killed or crippled, and it's probably not funny, but it is funny because he looked like he had just been beaten to death by something with multiple claws. Another chapter from the Wile E. Coyote book of fiascos, debacles, and worst case scenarios. But he had seen what we were doing, had surmised what we were using, and in his mind, his orange cord and our orange ropes approximated the same thing. And in an attempt to imitate what we were doing, he had failed miserably. I wonder, do we look at other people? In fact, I know we look at other people. We look at Instagram and we look at Facebook. And we look at the things that people are saying, this is fun, this is cool, this is love, this is relationship, this is pick your poison. And then based on what we see, not what we know, based on what we see, we approximate what they're using to be in love, or to be funny, or to be successful, or to be cool, or to be satisfied, or whatever. And I'm afraid sometimes we end up like Charles. We end up with a suboptimal experience. We're using gear, we're using things that, there's some things that weren't designed to repel with. Well, there's some things that aren't designed for happiness. There's some things that aren't designed for success. There's some things that aren't designed for relationships. And all of a sudden, we're using these things that weren't designed for what we think we're doing with them. And wow, we have these tragedies. And we end up walking through life scratched and cut and wounded, and wondering, why didn't it work for me like it worked for you? Well, number one, we weren't using what you thought we were using, and we weren't doing what you thought we were doing. When we begin to look at what it means to be content or successful or spiritual or in love or whatever, let's make sure we have all the information. Let's make sure that we're using what they actually used to get where they got. And let's really make sure that they actually got what we think they got or did what we think they did. Because so many times we see people who feign or who have a facade of happiness, contentment, success, or spirituality, and it's not accurate. It's not true. You see, if I see you do something and I think I know how you did it, I know what you did it with, but I choose the wrong tool, I choose the wrong technique, I choose the wrong approach, what I end up with is a tragedy. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. But if you imitate something, it's got to be an authentic imitation. It can't be an approximation. It can't be something that approaches it. It can't be something that's close to it. It's got to be the real stuff. You can't rappel on an extension cord. You can't climb on an extension cord. You can't run a power tool with a bright orange PMI rope either. You can't even plug that in. But taking things that look similar and acting as if they are the same that's a bad trade. Oh, this looks like what they used. I think I'll use it and I'll be successful. No, if you use something that just looks like success or love or happiness or contentment or spirituality, if you use a cheap version of that, you end up not only being disappointed, in the end, you probably just end up not just failing, but falling. And you end up being injured. And people who have been hurt other people. Hurt people end up hurting people. And we end up in positions to be hurt or hurt others when we create these repetitive cycles of dysfunctional marriages, dysfunctional relationships, dysfunctional church. We see a pattern, we see a thing, and we think, hey, that looks like X, Y, or Z, and we try to implement that in our own lives. And because it's not authentic, because it's not what actually is used for relationship or church or success or contentment or happiness, we end up taking that set of scars, that set of scratches, that bundle of injuries into our next relationship or our children's relationship or the church down the road or whatever. And these things have a way of becoming cyclical and generational. Now, there's some exceptions. There's some times when, you have the original generation. You have the ground zero where these things start. But for the most part, I get my messages about what X, Y, or Z is from somebody else. Charles imitated me and Bobby. Bobby and I were imitating something we'd seen on SWAT, the TV series. We were imitating the thing that we could see in the ROTC magazine where these guys had tied these Swiss seats around them. It may be wrong to judge Charles because he was using an approximation. This could very well be the same story that I was using a grass rope. And I remember distinctly being out near where Lamar Harbin lived, and Lamar saying, "Hey, Lonnie, I want to know how you shinny down those ropes." Neither rappelling nor abseiling, but Lamar, this guy that worked with the youth at church, wanted to know about shinnying down a rope. And I can remember putting a grass rope over the edge of a rock cliff and doing a triple carabiner wrap around it and walking down the side of this rock much higher than any tree I'd been in and much higher than any dirt bank I'd been on. And then I remember attaching Sammy Haynes to it. And I remember cautioning Sammy, telling him, look, you got to walk down slow. You can't slide and bounce, because something in my mind knew that sliding and bouncing would not work with grass rope. I've often had the pit of my stomach fall out and ask myself, man, what would have happened if that rope had broken with Sammy Haynes? What would have happened if that rope had broken with me? I could have easily been the guy who showed up at school or not gone back to school because I was using a grass rope and not a kern mantle rope. You see, we get to make fun of Charles because he got all scratched up and it didn't kill him. But I used things that I wasn't supposed to use to rappel with either, and I got lucky enough to survive. I dodged a lot of dumb bullets. I got lucky. I got by with it. And then some 30-something years later, I sit here and make fun of Charles, and I did the same thing Charles did. Mine just didn't cost me what it cost Charles. And I really don't know what would have been worse. me getting hurt on the rope, or somebody that I thought a lot of getting hurt on that rope. I've often thought about taking the responsibility of other people's safety in my hands when I've taken them climbing or taught them to rappel. And making sure I had good gear, making sure I had good technique, and making sure I had good anchor points. Because probably the real tragedy in some of this stuff is not that I got hurt. But the real tragedy in this would be that if I used something that wasn't standard, if I used something that wasn't accurate, if I were approximating what this was supposed to be, and my system failed me, and because somebody else trusted me, it failed them. What would you do if the choices that you made, if the decision, hey, this looks like this, let's do that, but you ended up not being the person who fell and got scratched and cut and injured and scarred and wounded, but if it were somebody else, somebody who trusted you, somebody who followed you, somebody who imitated you. And in our pursuit to imitate them, the world, in our pursuit to say this is love and success and happiness and church and spirituality, if in our pursuit to do that we chose the things that were not authentic and somebody else followed a bad example that we'd followed simply because they trusted us, and we led them to a place that exposed them to failing or falling or injury, that would spell disaster. There are 32 miles of cave passages in Cumberland Cavern. 333 feet underground is the Volcano Room. The Volcano Room is the site for the youth rally known as Erupt. It's an underground youth rally. It's an annual event. It takes place in October. The next Erupt is scheduled for October of 2021. Erupt is a sponsor of Keeping Up with Jones, the Lonnie Jones podcast adventure. If you'd like more information, you may contact them at eruptyouthRally@gmail.com. That's eruptyouthRally@gmail.com. Or check out their website for more information, 3 W's and a dot, eruptyouthRally.com, www.eruptyouthRally.com.